I think the biggest piece of advice that I can give them is don't let an advisor tell you what to do because you're going to be left holding the bag. So if I come in and say, hey, go hire 3, 4 more providers, open up 3 more clinics and do all this, at the end of the day, they have to live with that decision. So if you are preparing for or if you're thinking about doing a sale 3 to 5 years down the road, my biggest recommendation is just continue doing what you're doing, right?
Welcome to season 3 of the Ophthalmology Experience powered by Boost Patients. Today we're joined by Michael Kroin. Michael is the CEO and managing partner of Physician Growth Partners. He began his career as a healthcare investment banker, working closely with specialty physician practices and helping position them for transaction with private equity firms, medical groups, hospitals, and health systems. Today, he leads transaction execution for independent physician practices and groups, guiding them through the complex process of growth, partnerships, and succession planning. Michael, welcome to the show.
I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I'm really interested to get your perspective on the landscape since you're part of these transactions, and me on the practice side get to hear just peripherally kind of what's going on. We hear people talk about trends. I've heard that at the past few years before this year that PE transactions have slowed down compared to 5 years ago. But I really want to dive in and get your perspective, and maybe we can also provide a little guidance to any physicians who are considering a sale or a partnership or any kind of transaction with PE or any big group or medical group, that you can provide some things that you've learned, some things that
Yep.
you've seen happen with other physicians, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate you having me and happy to kind of provide my thoughts here. Let me start with kind of the question on guidance. And
Mhm.
physicians are contemplating doing something. How should they consider? What should they consider doing? Right when it comes to a decision with doing a transaction. And look, I think the thought process here is when you're thinking about doing a transaction, you can't just think about it from just an economic perspective. You got to really focus in on what life will look like post transaction. And is it something that you can be comfortable with around how life will look like? And will it look like similar to what it looked like before the transaction from the clinical practice of medicine? So, a key consideration that we would look at is not just economics, but also thinking about 3 additional factors as you're considering your options that are out there. Number one is control. How much control can you ultimately retain at the local level so that you can, your clinical practice of medicine isn't impeded by some financial guys that's sitting in the background, and at the same time, the day-to-day decisions still stay at the local level, right? Is there a group out there that can ultimately achieve that goal? The second piece that we would ultimately advise our clients to consider is what type of resources can these groups actually provide to alleviate some of the burdens that you're experiencing as an independent practice today,
Mhm.
whether it's recruiting, whether it's HR and admin, whether it's business developing, opening up new clinics, payer renegotiations, etc. And then the last consideration is like a big bucket is understanding the track record of these groups, right? And making sure that you're joining a group that is successful, that understands how to connect with doctors, understands how to work with doctors, and doesn't impede on how they practice, right? And do they have a good track record of doing so? So generally speaking, of the physicians that done deals 3, 5, 7 years ago, are they generally still happy on with the transaction they did, right? So when you think about consideration, you got to think about it kind of 4 prongs. I would consider is economics, right, in deal terms.
Sure.
Number 2 is control and autonomy. Uh, 3 is resources, and then 4 is what's their track record. And if those 4 boxes can be checked, then there should be strong consideration. Say, hey, look, private equity may make sense for my practice.
And in your experience in those 4 boxes, are the physicians able to tick most of the needs, and also the PE firm also able to tick the needs? Like, if more often than not, is there common ground in those 4 boxes?
Yeah, look, not all private equity groups are created equal, right? I think there's certain groups out there that have no business of being in healthcare, right? And at the
Mhm.
same time, there's groups that are out there that kind of figured out how to work with physicians, right?
Yeah,
So I think at the end of the day, can we navigate through your options, or can you navigate through your options to identify groups that could be the right cultural fit for you? Very much so. Is that going to be every option that's out there? Absolutely not.
yeah, sure. And I'm sure that, and as you mentioned, there's not all PE firms are created equal. There's probably some ratio of approach in terms of, are they just gonna be there to provide economic resources? Or on the flip side, are they gonna come in and change all your practice operations and change how you know, run the business, and there's everything in between. Is there a Have you seen in your experience a sweet spot that, you know, PE firms who kind of fall within that spectrum tend to be really successful with the practice in ophthalmology?
Yeah. No, I think there are some groups if you negotiate, is it at the end of the day, it's ultimately negotiating the right governance charter at the local level, where you focus on any sort of clinical and day-to-day decisions to be left in the control of the doctors, right? So that's bucket one. So day-to-day clinical control, whether that's vacation days, support staff, hiring, firing physicians, promoting physicians to partners, things along those lines. All those that balance and letting physicians take control of that, I think is very important. There's also metrics where you negotiate with a charter around joint decisions, meaning that if there's some capital involved in terms of a new location, or if there's capital, or if there's like, hey, we need to spend $100,000 on a new machine, right? There needs to be a level of decision that forces some sort of veto right between whether it's either the practice or the private equity firm or the management company, right? And having a balance where it's like, okay, we still have a level of control on telling them, well, we don't want you to acquire that practice next door because they don't have a good reputation. But at the same time, if both parties agree they could move forward, having that joint decision that's a little bit more broader decision that involves capital, I think is very important. And then the last bucket is where's the control going to sit at the private equity side, right? And that's usually comes into the lens of them acquiring an asset in a completely different geography, them in a position to do a future liquidity event, them
Mhm.
making some decision on that at the board level, et cetera. So that would sit at the MSO level, at the private equity side, right?
Sure.
If you have a good balance between what impacts the doctor on a day-to-day basis is left to the doctor's control. What impacts the doctor on more of like a key business decision or strategic decision is more of like a joint control.
Mhm.
And then you have anything that doesn't really impact the doctor directly is kind of left at the management company level.
Yeah.
That will create a good balance.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. One of the things I was thinking about as you were kind of explaining that is that on the doctor level, like clinical staffing and day-to-day decision making, leaving that up to the provider. Have you ever seen situations though? Because, for example, I've heard people in the market tell me, "Yeah, our practice just got acquired by private equity, and they just told us, you know, our staffing costs as a percent of our revenue is currently at 33, and we need to get down to 30." And but some of those staffing decisions will impact that that metric. And so how do you account for, okay, well, I gave you control over your day-to-day operations. Now I'm telling you you need to bring your staffing expense down by 3%. Do you ever and the reason I'm asking that specific example because somebody has told me that
Yeah,
before.
no, that's a great question, and I think that's the importance of making sure that you negotiate a transaction that is not just around economics, but also around certain points that you're mentioning, right? So
Uh-huh.
it's interesting you mentioned that because in a recent, I had a client that recently called me and said, "Hey, I thought this private equity firm couldn't change our staffing levels based on what we negotiated." And we then went back into the appropriate document that reflected that and said, "You're right, they can't. Look at this document. Let's just send this to them to make sure that they understand that if they would do any changes, it would be in breach of this contract." And they quickly took 10 steps back.
Sure.
So it's
Yeah.
very important not to just, hey, let's shake hands and make it, let's trust each other. It's very important to memorialize all these certain points that will make an impact on the day-to-day decisions, right? So
Right.
with that governance charter is having it fully written out in a way
Mhm.
to ensure that it covers key aspects like what you're mentioning is so important. I think, look, at the same time, there are certain decisions that need to be made in terms of saying, hey, look, from a back office side, knowing that we can potentially centralize scheduling or some revenue cycle or things along those lines, does it make a business decision sense? Does it make sense to potentially reduce the staffing levels because it's not necessary to have the redundancy? And I think that conversation is always fruitful to have,
Sure.
but it needs to be done in a way with the approval of the local practice.
Quick break brought to you by Boost Patients. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a physician, a practice admin, or maybe someone on the marketing team, and you really have a singular goal. You want new patients, more consults, higher surgery volume. And oftentimes, when you want that, you think immediately about marketing, spending more on marketing, investing more in marketing. Maybe, but probably not. We've mystery shopped over 600 practices, and there's one commonality with all of them. They're not very effective and not very good at patient follow-up. So before you invest more money in marketing and more into that investment, you really need to understand how your practice is following up with new patients. So go to boostpatients.com, fill out the contact us form, and let me know that you want us to mystery shop your practice. We'll mystery shop it. We'll document how your practice follows up with your new patient lanes, and we'll share that information with you. Now back to the show.
Yeah, and I'm assuming you're helping providers navigate those conversations because some of those things you don't always think about
Right.
beforehand because they haven't happened. So, would you say that the most successful practices that have a longer term success with merging or being acquired by a PE firm are the ones that did that you either got some help from someone like yourself or spent X amount of time in laying out the governance structure to ensure that there was some form of agreement of how we're going to operate, as opposed to, yes, looks great,
Right.
great number.
Yeah. No, and whether it's us or another advisor or a good attorney, I mean, I think the biggest thing you need to think about is don't just focus on the economics, really focus on what post-life transaction looks like,
For sure.
right? Because you'll quickly forget about that check you got, you know, 2, 3, 4 months later, and now you have to live with the decision you've made. And you got to make sure that the next, let's call it 5 years that you sign up for is a decision that you can sit here 2, 3 years later and say, "Hey, that was a good decision." Right?
Right. So, um, have you always been in the healthcare space doing this, or what's your background?
Yeah, so, I was I worked at a prior to starting Physician Growth Partners, I worked at a prior firm doing healthcare investment banking,
Okay.
and then I ended up starting Physician Growth Partners because I saw the writing on the wall that everyone was focusing on the economics and not enough attention was focused on the quality of life post deal
Yeah.
and the decision making cadences and control, resource track record, the cultural fit aspect,
Right.
which ultimately pushed me to kind of start this to take more of a comprehensive approach to the marketplace.
Okay. So you've had a good amount of time to kind of see what's going on in the healthcare space in terms of activity. Where are we right now in the pre cycle?
Yeah, no, I think it's still it's interesting you say that. So one thing that transpired that we haven't seen in the past, specifically within eye care, is you had some of the, let's call it conglomerate distributors start entering into the provider sector, right? So you have McKesson recently partnered with Prism. You have Retina Consultants of America recently going with Cencora. And then there's some additional noise that other strategics are starting to try to potentially get into the marketplace. I think from that lens, it is actually providing additional options that are out there that are, that aren't just PE, right? Where you have kind of more of strategic groups that are out there.
Mhm.
I think at the same time, you're very right that over the past couple years, there has been a slowdown. Obviously, there was instability with interest rates and not knowing where things were going. At the same time, I think a lot of these practices got too excited and buying up a lot of opportunities. where they
Mm.
needed to kind of say, okay, we bought all this. Now, how do we help our local practices and focus on them rather than continue to be on a buying spree? But what we saw over the last 3 to 6 months is a lot of these groups that were kind of closed for business in terms of additional acquisition are now open for business. We're seeing a lot of activity even in our umbrella, some of the announcements that we're seeing, et cetera. So we do see the market back open, but it doesn't change the fact that the beauty about evaluating a process now versus 5 years ago or 7 years ago or
Mm.
8 years ago or whenever this all started is you can evaluate the track record of these groups. And that's the key on why it may even be better to look at these deals now versus before is because now you actually can do your homework. It's not just, oh, this is our first investment in eye care. Let's hope this works. It's like, no, how have you done over the last several years? How have
Mhm.
your financial performance been? How are doctors generally happy? What's your physician attrition? How have you been able to create value at these local practices, et cetera?
So McKesson and Cardinal Health, I wasn't aware of that, are getting into deals now and acquiring physician groups?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you have Cardinal Health that got into the urology sector. They got into the oncology sector. You got McKesson within the eye care sector. Cencora is also in the eye care sector. So you are starting to see, these conglomerates enter into the provider sector as well.
Interesting. There's no, there's no conflicts there in terms of controlling more of the supply chain, so to speak?
Um, yeah, I mean, look, obviously there may be or may not.
Yeah.
That's above my pay grade around kind of the regulatory
Yeah,
side.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do think that look, when you're an independent practice, at the end of the day, look at the end of the day, who are you competing against, right? It's not really the practice next door. It's you're fighting against the payers that are out there that are multi-billion-dollar organizations, and also you're fighting against the hospital and health systems,
Mhm.
right? That are also multi-billion-dollar organizations. And what do these two large groups do to the independent practice of medicine? Well, they continue to put additional pressures to that practice of medicine. So for the independent folks. So for the independent folks to be able to say, "Hey, look, how do I get a backbone here to be able to still benefit from economies of scale? How do I get a backbone to benefit from the fact that we have additional resources that can actually help us?"
Mhm.
It's not a bad option to evaluate, "Hey, can I join another private equity group?" But that private equity group has a portfolio of eye care doctors that's now we're, 300 of us that we can share best practices. So
Sure.
there's a way to think about this in a way where all this pressure that's coming from reimbursement rate decline, right? And the pressures from labor inflation going up and all these other points. It's like if you're not growing at this day and age, well, guess what's happening? You're marginalizing your income. It's tougher to practice today than it was yesterday. It's gonna be tougher practicing tomorrow than it is today. And how do you fight that fight? Is you have to continue to scale, right?
In From your experience, would you say, as you're looking at those opportunities, is there a type of practice that's you've seen be more successful or that's more sought out? Like, is it a 2 to 3 location, 1 doc, single doc, or is it a larger private group that has 8 multiple ASCs or does it just depend? I mean, have you seen any that they are really going after more?
No, look, I think at the end of the day, it all is dependent on you know, the specific group if it's willing to go down the private equity route. I
Uh,
think where you see constraints is yes, obviously more scale and more dominance, et cetera, within a market, positions you for more of a premium multiple, right? Um, but I think where actually what you're seeing right now isn't, hey, if I'm a 2 or 3 provider practice, can I sell my business to private equity or strategic? It's not really around size, it's around where you are actually located from a state perspective. Because there's 2 things that are going on. Number 1, depending on the state, there is, the regulatory environment for the corporate practice of medicine is continuing to get stricter and stricter, right? And depending on if there's any sort of eye care consolidators in that state or not, can ultimately determine if you can gain, perhaps have a transaction done, knowing that if that state isn't open for business for new private equity firms, or new private equity
Sure.
firms aren't really getting aren't comfortable to enter into a market because of the regulatory environment, it could prevent the transaction, right?
Yeah.
So we're seeing that as a lens that may be a hurdle that that these groups would need to overcome. And then I think at the same time, it also depends on size and scale will matter in the event that there is no other private equity backed or strategic group in that specific market.
Mhm. Yeah, just I guess depending on where that group wants to be or the market coverage of other practices or whatever. So I think I asked you the question, but I think the answer is depends, right? Because as you mentioned, it just really depends on the state, the situation. And, I was also thinking too, we talked a little about, I told you my experience of what I hear. I still hear a little bit of, I don't know, skepticism, or you'll hear that sometimes, especially from the providers who have been in practice a long time. And so, what are some of the things that, from your perspective, some of those skepticisms that you hear, or what are some misconceptions or things that maybe that they don't understand, or are they right?
So I think there is. It's interesting because I would say that there's just as many good groups out there that are private equity backed as there are bad, right? And not all private equity groups are created equal, just like not all eye doctors are created equal. You have the good, you have the bad, just like in any industry, advisors as well. And I think there are scenarios where the doctors are correct, right? Hey, they came in, they told me that I can't have the three techs. Now I have to go down to two, or I had four rooms. Now I have to go down to three because we added another physician. It's like those facts may be true, right? But I think at the same time, there are groups out there that are very much hold themselves to potentially even a similar standard or higher standard than that independent practice as well, right? And I think that's where you got to navigate through is understanding, hey, how do we, decipher the good from the bad, more so than just saying, hey, and generally, private equity is such a, is the big bad wolf, right? Because if it was really that bad, you would see that it would be a massive hiatus of everyone leaving these transactions, right? But you're generally not seeing that, right? You're seeing deals still continue to get done, right? You still see, yeah, you have maybe a couple physicians leave here and there, but for the most part, the groups are still staying intact. So the fact pattern there is that, yes, I would say that there are scenarios where, people are perhaps didn't know what they're signing themselves up for, or private equity, may have impeded on how they thought they should be practicing or things along those lines. But at the same time, it can't just be a general statement. It has to be on a
Sure.
situation by situation basis.
Yeah, it's not too dissimilar from, it's at the practice level. You might make an investment in a software that didn't work out. And usually when you look at that investment, it's because you didn't do enough due diligence, you didn't understand the need. So I'm sure it's similar, right? That so in order to have a successful transaction, you need to really do your homework.
Yeah, no, very much so. I think just as the thought process on as much as homework that these private equity groups do on you, you got to do on them, right?
Yeah,
Because it's going to be one of the most important decisions of your career in the
sure.
event that you move forward with one of those parties.
So, when it comes to homework, I'm assuming in some of the support that you provide to these physicians that are looking at these potential transactions, that there is some level of support. What is a typical partnership or look like when somebody approaches you and say, "Hey, we'd like some support"? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we're ultimately advisors, so we will represent you and hold your hand from start to finish. And our job as advisors is to present you all of your options that ultimately can achieve your specific goals and succession plans, and be able to navigate through those options to continue to funnel down to a point when you're in a position to make a decision of one of those options or one of those group buyers,
Mhm.
right? And the key to that hand-holding isn't just around how do we get you the best value or the highest value. The key to that hand-holding is how do we put you in the best position to make a decision, not just around economics, but around what my employment agreement is gonna look like. What is the governance structure is gonna look like? What's the purchase agreement gonna look like? What's the operating agreement look like? At the same time, you know, can I make a decision based on their track record? Like I said before, financials, physician attrition, talking to a bunch of their references, not just the ones that they give us, but actually, saying, hey, let's call this doctor. He seems like he's in the portfolio, making sure we're testing it.
Mhm.
So our engagement and our process is in what success for us is putting our clients in the best position to make a decision. And ultimately, you know, at the end of the day, if they decide to move forward, that's fantastic. But I think what means for us is if I call them 2, 3 years later and they sit there and say, well, yes, there was a little bit tough on integration, et cetera, but I would have done this deal over and over again.
Mhm.
Right. And that's what success means for us.
Sure. And I'm sure part of that initially is that you need to understand a little bit about the practice that's considering this, right? You do some kind of a discovery with that
Correct.
practice.
Yeah. So we only get paid on success. Right.
Uh,
So a big piece for us is to educate our clients on what a deal may look like.
mhm,
So what we do there is obviously we present our credentials, we present what some of the options are, what a potential valuation would look like, what a potential governance charter would look like, and things along those lines to help put them in a position to answer two questions. Number one, is there enough engagement to the group to say, you know what, Michael, all of this sounds great. We want to see it for ourselves. Let's explore a process.
mhm.
And number two, do we want to use Michael as an advisor or do we want to use someone else? Right. Or do it on our own?
Yeah. And let's say that a practice considering it, but they're not, maybe it's not today, but they think they'd like to do a deal in 3 to 5 years. How would you advise them to start preparing themselves now?
I think the biggest piece of advice that I can give them is don't let an advisor tell you what to do because you're going to be left holding the bag. So if I come in and say, "Hey, go hire 3, 4 more providers, open up 3 more clinics and do all this," at the end of the day, they have to live with that decision, right? So
Yep.
I wouldn't be in the right position to make that decision for them. So if you are preparing for or if you're thinking about doing a sale 3 to 5 years down the road, my biggest recommendation is just continue doing what you're doing, right? And
Mhm.
if you're on a growing pattern where you're opening 1 to 2 locations per year, keep doing that. If you're on the pattern of opening up a surgery center, go ahead and open it and let us work with what we have here versus you trying to be somebody that you're not.
Yeah. Um, Makes sense. Kind of feels like what you tell your kids, like be who you're going to be, and the right person will come along, right?
Yeah, that's what I tell those kids right behind me every day.
Uh, so just to wrap up, I mean, is there, as far as working with you guys, physician growth partners, anything else that we haven't talked about that you think that they should know in terms of working with you, or just in general in terms of PE acquisitions?
Yeah, no, yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, look, I think the big thing that for us is we're probably considered one of the most active advisors, if not the most active advisor in the physician practice management space. We've done over 80 transactions over the last several years, representing independent groups with private equity and strategic buyers. At the same time, within eye care, we're approaching over 20 transactions working with eye care groups. And we actually have closed several transactions over the last several months and are in the process of closing a couple additional transactions. And the reason why I say that it ultimately puts us in even a better position to work with future clients as well because of our experience and our knowledge and proprietary information continues to grow and grow and grow. Our tool set continues to grow,
Mhm.
ultimately putting us in a better position to continue to help clients and navigate through a process and putting them in a better position to make decisions.
Michael, appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your wisdom. I mean, I personally like to learn because I've been in a private practice for 20 years, so I don't have a lot of exposure to these things except what I hear. So it's great to have people like yourself who have been part of this world to come help share some wisdom and what's actually going on. So I appreciate you joining.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me, and hopefully the audience found this helpful and you also found this helpful.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I also want to take a moment to thank the listeners for joining us. If you enjoyed the conversation, please make sure to subscribe and share us with your friends on social media. Another shout out to Boost Patients for producing the podcast. Boost helps ophthalmology practices get more new patients without spending a dime on marketing. You can learn more about them at their website at boostpatients.com. Until next time, have a great week.